Today's episode is with Yotam Perkal.
Especially if you've done manual triaging of vulnerabilities, you know that we rely more on third-party software, whether commercial or open source. Now we know more, we have more things to address, to attend to. So things like asset inventory, password policies, MFA, that's really the challenge. Like we need some kind of crystal ball that will let us know what we need to focus on. Can the vulnerability be exploited? Is it actually being exploited in the wild? Kind of makes sense, okay, we don't want any more people to download it, but what about like the evidence? So I think there are a couple of interesting initiatives in that direction. I will say that I don't think basically you can look at it as the main there are a lot of different like use cases for SBOM, but I think once you have the SBOM and you can
Hi everyone, this is Purushottam and thanks for tuning into Scale to Zero podcast. Today's episode is with Yotam Perkal. Yotam currently leads the vulnerability research team at Resilient. Prior to Resilient, he worked at PayPal security organization dealing with vulnerability management, threat intelligence, and insider threats. He is also a committee member of the PyCon Israel organization and takes part in several OpenSSF working groups around open source security, as well as several CISA work streams around SBOM and VEX. Yotam, welcome to the show. For our audience who may not be familiar with you and your work, do you want to share about your journey?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. And yeah, you describe it pretty accurately. Actually, was fortunate enough to kind of go through various different positions in the industry. I started actually as a software automation engineer doing testing for security oriented products, and then moved to software engineering, and then more uh, to the more data science machine learning aspect of security and doing and conducting security research. Yeah, and for the last 4 years, I'm with Resilient, mostly doing security and vulnerability research. Also had like a short stint as leading the cloud engineering team at Resilient. So doing some more like DevOps work, which was interesting as well. Yeah, that's
Lovely. So
basically.
you have experience on both the engineering side, DevOps side, and also security. So you can see them from both the perspectives, right? Uh,
Yeah,
Makes a
I
lot of
think
sense.
I think for me, I really I'm a really strong believer also in I enjoy it personally also to have like a broad base of knowledge and trying to tinker with all sorts of things. I think at the end of the day, you kind of pick on more tools in your belt so that when you tackle a problem, then you have more ways to go about it. So yeah,
And you also get different perspectives, right, while
exactly.
working on, let's say, security. Makes a lot of sense. So I asked this question before we start the podcast to everyone, and I get interesting answers also, right? What does a day in your life look like?
So it varies. I think a lot is focused on the research front. I do a lot of research around things that are kind of related to what our product does. So a lot of vulnerability management, package managers, vulnerability scanners, looking at various gaps of these tools, or things that are kind of scanners. I just gave a talk at B-Sides Las Vegas about like hidden vulnerabilities in Docker containers. So stuff that are installed, that are deployed not via the package managers, and because the scanners rely on the package managers in order to identify them, then they're basically blind. They don't see the package exists, and then if that package has vulnerabilities, they don't see it. So it's a lot of varied work in terms of the research, which is super interesting,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and also some of the insights that stem from the research also kind of go back towards like the product. If there are interesting gaps or things that the research kind of surfaces, then we make sure that our product is able to identify them and address them. So that's also another aspect.
Lovely. So it sounds like you love vulnerability management, and
Yeah.
that's one of the topics we want to talk about, right? So let's dive into it. So the first question that I have is, um, as we are all familiar, right? Cyber attacks have affected over 60% of the companies, and all of these start with some sort of vulnerabilities. And it looks like there is a gap in organizations' vulnerability management process, right? So my question is, when it comes to managing vulnerabilities, where do organizations make mistakes?
So I think, yeah, like you said, I don't know if I'd say all attacks start with vulnerabilities, because you also have, like, social engineering or phishing, but it's definitely one of the main vectors in terms of initial access to the organization is definitely constantly, and even I think in the last years it's on the rise, exploiting known vulnerabilities. So it's
Mm-hmm,
definitely a super impactful aspect of security practices.
mm-hmm,
And I think it is challenging, to especially if you've done manual triaging of vulnerabilities, that it's a very specific, and not very rewarding process when you have to go through and validate the output of the scanners and make and check whether it's applicable in the case of your specific organization, your specific environment. So it's very challenging, and I think
mm-hmm,
a lot of like maybe I wouldn't say mistakes, but a lot of organizations simply don't have. There's always like this long tail of organizations that are less mature in terms of, they don't have the people or the processes or the technology in place in order for them to be able to cope with the amount of vulnerabilities that they have in an effective manner. Um,
okay. Makes sense. So maturity, the right skill set, right people, those are like some of the mistakes, or not even mistakes. Like those are some of the gaps that happen, right? What are some of the challenges that organizations face? Let's say an organization has the maturity.
mhm.
Uh, then in Are there any challenges that they are facing, even though they have, let's say, the process tools and people?
Yeah, so definitely, we see there is a constant rise in the amount of vulnerabilities that are being discovered and published, and it's no,
Mm-hmm,
it's not really surprising. We are at a point where we rely more on third-party software, whether commercial or open source, in
mm-hmm,
order to advance, the business objectives of organizations. It allows us to run faster,
mm-hmm,
with the rise of DevOps, etc. So hardly you see people writing code from scratch. You either,
mm-hmm,
import libraries that you use, or use, I need a web server, so I'll just use Nginx, which is an open source one.
mm-hmm,
Again, it has advantages. It allows us to move faster, to deploy faster, to focus on, the core business logic. But it also comes with risk, and one of those risks is in the form of known vulnerabilities. And I think as systems get more complex, and the amount of code that is being written keeps rising, so we have more vulnerabilities. And so definitely one of the challenges is just being able to cope with this sheer volume
volume.
of vulnerabilities. Yeah, and I think also um, the old, like, paradigms, the way that we used to do vulnerability management has to change, because this gap isn't something that is going to vanish. It will only
Mhm.
get worse, because we see the trend. So you need, if in the old days you'd say, okay, you need to patch everything, I don't think that's really practical or even smart advice. this day and age.
Right. Mhm. And so one of the things that you highlighted is the known vulnerabilities, right? And there are so many types of vulnerabilities we hear about. Like it's not like they never existed. They are now visible, more visible now because of SBOMs and other initiatives.
Hmm.
There can be like cloud misconfiguration, 0 days, data encryption, or like insider threats. And as you rightly said, an organization cannot just fix all of them, because either you cannot just chase like thousands of vulnerabilities and fix all of them, and also that doesn't directly help your business priorities. So sometimes you deprioritize the vulnerabilities related work.
Hmm.
So let's say I'm a first time security leader. How should I stay on top of all of this?
So I think you touched on that's a great point because as we gain more visibility with the the growing adoption of SBOM, which is great. Like now we know more about what's going on in our environment. We have more visibility, we have more context, which is great. But it's kind of like a double-edged sword because now we know more. We have more things to address, to attend to. So
Hmm.
so it's definitely a challenge, as you highlighted, and I think in the context of what to start with as a first time someone who's just starting to gain grasp of everything, which can be
Hmm.
overwhelming. So I would say start with the basics can go a long way. So things like asset inventory, password policies, MFA, logging, having logging in place, monitoring in place, just to have visibility into what you have. It's a super important aspect, I think. And I think also if you need to invest in something when you start off,
Hmm.
I think you should invest in automation, because when you have automation in place, it allows you to reduce the manual toil, manual work that you need to take in order to address different security challenges. So that's what I would recommend.
Okay. And one of the things that you rightly highlighted is that nowadays we don't write things from scratch a lot, right? We
Hmm.
see if there is an open source version, then we start adopting it. Maybe we do due diligence, or sometimes we miss to do the due diligence. Or as you highlighted, right? I need a web server. There is Nginx. Maybe I'll just use that right away. So as part of that, we often get inundated with so many vulnerabilities, right? The sheer volume is high.
Hmm.
How should security leaders ensure that they are focusing on the right and the highest priority vulnerabilities?
Hmm. So again, I think that's a really good question because that's the challenge. That's really the challenge. Like we need some kind of crystal ball that will let us know what we need to focus on. And I think in that aspect, the key is context. So we need to have as much context available for us as possible in order for us to be able to make the decisions in a more intelligent way that is optimized toward reducing the risk. So we need to
Mm-hmm.
focus on the vulnerabilities that matter most. So and then the question is, okay, so where do I get this context? So I think there are two main sources. I would say if I can divide it like to two, and I think they're both like equally important. So you have like internal context, which comes from things like asset criticality, business context, or things like specific configuration, like environmental characteristics of your environment. And then you have external context, which is like exploitability. Can the vulnerability be exploited? Is it actually being exploited in the wild? And if not, what's like the probability of exploitation of it to be exploited? So this is where things like EPSS comes in, which I think we'll probably discuss later on. So, and I think so. The more context you have, then you are able to make sure that you make the right decisions and you focus on what matters most in terms of risk reduction. And then once you have that context, then all you need to do is not that it's just simple, and unfortunately most organizations aren't at that point yet, but what you should be doing is have some kind of process in place in order to take that context and make it actionable. So this is where things like SSVC, which we'll also hopefully discuss later, comes into play, which you have like this decision process that you can make based on that context. And then you know, okay, these are the things that I deal with, and these are the things that I deal with if I have time, and these are the things that I currently leave aside. So that's kind of the way I see it.
And that makes a lot of sense, right? It should not be that you are just going through criticals first, high second, and then you continue. Rather, add the context to it so that you can do better prioritization
Exactly.
of the vulnerability.
Exactly.
Makes sense. One of the things you highlighted earlier, like the basics when it comes to doing the basics, is asset inventory, right?
Mhm.
And one of the aspects of vulnerability program is that, and with the recent rise of adoption of like the open source software, it has become more challenging now, especially like recently we heard about the supply chain security attacks on SolarWinds, Twilio, PyPy, OpenSSL, and many more. So we received this question from a first time security leader: how to design the vulnerability management program so that we can tackle the challenges with supply chain security.
Um, So I think in that context, I think it's often kind of tempting to try and look at supply chain risk in the same lens that we look at vulnerabilities, but
Hmm.
often that's not really the case. It's kind of two different problems. They are related. They have a lot of common aspects, and I think a lot of the ways that we try to deal with vulnerabilities can apply to them. For example, SBOM can provide value both in terms of vulnerability management, incident response, as well as in the context of supply chain risk. But I think it is a different, more complex problem. And I think, and there is still, the way I see it, there's still a gap, like in terms of the mindset in the industry, in the different tooling and package repositories.
Hmm.
In how they kind of approach it. And I'll give an example. Um, for example, now when you have like a malicious package or discovered that is pushed, or like there's 1,000 packages malicious being pushed to PyP or npm or whatever. So the way
Hmm.
it's currently being handled, just the packages are being removed, which is
Hmm.
just kind of makes sense, okay, we don't want any more people to download it, but what about like the evidence? Like, how do we know that the same person behind those 1,000 package won't deploy, like push another 1,000 the next day? So
Hmm.
when we simply remove it, and don't keep any of the context, then it's harder to look at it from a higher level and kind of see the pattern, see the trends, look at it from an attacker perspective, and not, it's not like there's one of my colleagues from Checkmarks, the company that
Hmm.
deals with this problem. He says we're not facing a malicious package problem. We are looking at malicious, attackers. We need to identify the attackers, the patterns, the trends. So I think that is something that conceptually, I hope will change over time. I think OSV, which is an effort that, again, there's like uh, a group of security researchers and from different companies in Israel that we there's like this forum that we created, SCAR, when we try to tackle problems that are more like vendor agnostic in the industry level. And so a lot of the work
Hmm.
is talking with folks from those kind of that are in this intersection and trying to convey this message. And I think one of the positive things that I see is OSV recently added support in their schema for this kind of context. So, okay,
Oh,
what's the
nice.
malicious package? What is the method of injection? Is it compromising of the pipeline? Is it this specific version? Is it the rogue developer that pushed malicious code? What does the code do? Is it a crypto mining? Is it exploiting data? All these sort of things that are up until now weren't really recorded or documented in a,
Hmm.
at least in a way that is approachable and can help doing more security research and moving to a point where we're more proactive and less reactive.
Okay, nice.
Um,
So one of the things that stood out, what you said, and sometimes is confusing, is that folks think supply chain is equal to vulnerability management, but
yes,
it helps that these are not exactly the same. Of course, there is overlap, but it is not the same. So a follow-up question to that is, let's say I understand what's the difference between both of them. Is there a
Mhm.
framework that I can follow to make sure that my supply chain security is taken care of?
So I think there are a couple of interesting initiatives in that direction. I will say that I don't think it's a problem that one standard or one tool or one framework or one vendor will solve. It's a complex problem, and I think we need like industry-wide like collaboration to tackle it effectively. But there are definitely some interesting initiatives that try to help address it. So some things that come to mind that I'll highlight is salsa, which is like the supply level. Like basically, you can look at it as a maturity level of the repository in terms of how they are the security practices that they imply, and you can get to various. The higher salsa level you are, the more um, robust and reliable, you'd say the practices. So there's the OpenSF scorecard, for example, that tries to give various. There are different checks for again like the maturity of the repository. Are there being code reviewed before code is being merged into the main branch, various kind of security best practices, and then it based on all of these checks, it gives like a total score that is
Mhm.
supposed to help you if you kind of you want a specific functionality. You find two packages, and then you're debating between them, and then it can help you make a decision that choose a more mature, more security aware kind of project. And it also aims to help drive the maintainers to up their scorecard scores so that users will trust them more. And
It's a sort of win-win for both, right? Both for the maintainers, that their sort of profile is getting getting better scores, and also the folks who are adopting, they also see and they also adopt based on that score as well.
yeah, exactly. And I think another research that we recently conducted was utilizing this OpenSF scorecard and looking, for example, you see this trend now with generative AI and LLMs, and we kind of showed that projects that became super popular on GitHub, like tens of thousands of
Hmm.
stars in a matter of days or weeks, their security practices aren't there yet. So their scorecard scores are really low, and people often don't even. I wouldn't say don't address it at all, but maybe don't address it enough or take it as part of the decision process in terms of which project to use. And I think it's important to raise awareness to that. So that's also something that research that maybe we can link in. And I think it's
Sure.
interesting.
Yeah.
And also so there are additional like more like frameworks. There's something called the Open Software Supply Chain Attack Reference, which is OSCAR, kind of like the Mitra attack for supply chain
Hmm.
risk. So kind of mapping out the different avenues in which supply chain risk can occur and what stages, etc. So it's also something that I think is worth knowing. And the secure supply chain consumption framework, which is also so there are various like projects. I think still there's the more we'll see, and we're starting to see more sophisticated attacks from that, supply chain
Hmm.
risk attacks. Then it will get more like industry and security research focus, and hopefully there will be like a more um, higher level view of the problem, and we'll see more solutions.
Makes sense. One of the things that you highlighted earlier is, again, like SBOM. We
Mhm.
use open source more nowadays. So SBOMs are sort of becoming a key building block when it comes to building software and supply chain risk management, right? But can you help us understand, why would organization need a software bill of materials in the first place?
So I think there are a lot of different like use cases for SBOM, but I
Hmm.
think ultimately, the way I see it, it provides visibility and transparency, and also it allows software consumers to demand that transparency from the vendors that provide them their software. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and and I think it's also like the way I see it, it's kind of like a vehicle for context. So you have this kind of base layer, this building block, which is machine readable.
Mm-hmm.
So currently, it's more discussed in the context of dependencies and licensing, but once you have that, then you can layer in additional context on top of that, and then you can use that context to make decisions in a way that you can automate and action on in a way that is scalable. So, for example, let's take the VEX, which is
Mm-hmm.
vulnerability exploitability. Uh, Basically, it's something that you can tie into your SBOM, or it can be independent of the SBOM, and it lets you know whether a vulnerability is actually exploitable in the context of, let's say, a specific product or in the context of a specific environment. And then once you have the SBOM and you can layer in that information, then again you have more context in terms of what you need to focus on. And but I will say, like I said, it's not like a silver bullet. It's more the way I see it. It's a building block. It's super important to have,
Mm-hmm.
to standardize, but then once you have that, then it gets interesting, and you can more use cases will surface over time, I think.
So it's a way of like discovering the dependencies, and then at which the things which were not earlier visible, even now you can see. So it helps you build the context. Now let's say you ask all your vendors to give the SBOM data. You have the SBOM data. What are the challenges of sort of uh, not collecting, like interpreting that data that organizations face, and how can they overcome those challenges?
Mhm. So I think so. SBOM are getting into a point that they are now more common. Like most people have heard of SBOM in some way or another, and more people are starting to utilize it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think a lot of more people are appreciative of like the potential value that they can provide. But as you mentioned, there are still some challenges. I think one of the main challenges is, again, it's like a chicken and egg thing. So you need adoption for it to be more valuable and applicable. So one is driving adoption, and I think we also need to kind of lower the barrier of entry that is required to produce SBOMs,
Mm-hmm.
and again push more vendors to provide them, which is also will come from pressure from the consumer, and there's also some regulatory pressure that we see that kind of starts to mandate these things. But I think ultimately the main value, the main driver will be from the value that they can provide, because I really believe that it can solve a lot of problems. It can help solve,
Mm-hmm.
it won't solve. But And then there are like additional problems that I think as it will mature and gain more adoption, things that we consider like big issues now will seem less of an issue. Like, for example, I often hear claims about the trust issue. How can I trust the SBOM data? So first of
Mm-hmm.
all, have something. Even if you can trust it, at least you know what you have at certain level of credibility. So I think
Mm-hmm.
something is better than nothing, and these are things that need to happen gradually. Um,
Right.
so that's one, or the quality aspect. So how can I know that the SBOM is in good quality, and I think once, for example, if a vendor gives you an SBOM, then you don't have to immediately trust it and accept it as the ground truth. If you have a tool in your environment that can generate the same SBOM based on the runtime or the build process, and your tool tells you something that the vendor didn't tell you, then you can confront the vendor and tell him, okay, you said that this is what you have in the environment, but my tool says that this is what you have. So again, these are problems that as it more maturity and track record and more tooling will evolve, I think that then it's less of a problem than often people make it to be.
Makes a lot of sense, and you're right, that it helps you with the visibility. Now you know what is the surface area which you were even not familiar with earlier. It helps you build trust with your vendors because now they are sharing their SBOMs, and if you need to validate, you can validate as well. And so you are at a better position in terms of understanding different attack vectors, even coming through the vendors.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I think if
that's a.
an example that I like to give in that context is let's take vulnerability scanners. So we all agree
Mhm.
that there are super important, super valuable aspect of our security process, but we live with false positives, false negatives, and vulnerability scanners all day long, and no one raises an eyebrow. And they still provide an immense amount of value, but they're not. I wouldn't say I trust the scanner output at face value. So again, I think it's that we need some proportion, and something is better than nothing.
Mhm.
And again, over time, these things that are like big like uh, arguments against maybe adopting an SBOM will start to hear less and less of.
Yeah, hopefully the adoption, like as you said, right, it's a chicken and egg problem. So hopefully things get better sooner than later.
Yeah.
uh, One of the things we earlier spoke about is the prioritization, right? Like if there is sheer volume of vulnerabilities, how do I prioritize? One of the
Hmm.
things folks look at is the vulnerability score.
Hmm.
And there are multiple frameworks to do that, like CVSS, EPSS, SSVC. And in fact, CVSS released a new scoring system like version 4.0 a few weeks ago, and EPSS had something similar. They released 3.0. So, how do they differ from each other? Can you give me at a high level how do they differ, and uh, what's the effectiveness of these frameworks in the vulnerability management programs?
Sure. Yeah. So again, this is my opinion. I also recently gave a talk about that specific topic in the last besides Las Vegas. But I think it's a really important point to discuss. So let's start with CVSS, which is basically kind of like the de facto standard for kind of scoring, assessing vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm,
Um, And as you said, version 4 just recently started to roll out, which I think is
mm-hmm,
good. It aims to address a lot of the issues that former versions of CVSS already had, like the granularity to be able to have like a more granular score. So the differentiate, there are tens of thousands of vulnerabilities with a 9.8 CVSS score. So what's more severe, like it's not entirely sure. And recently we had a bunch of those that were published that the maintainers say that they shouldn't even be vulnerabilities, let alone a 9.8 severity score vulnerability, like in Postgres and curl. But so put that aside, but I do think that they're doing a good job. I think one of the problems with CVSS is not CVSS uh, as a system, and I think
mm-hmm.
it again it provides a lot of value. But I think the way that people use it isn't the way that it's meant to be used. So, for example, like the CVSS 3 score, even it comprised of three like different aspects. So you have the base score, the temporal score, and the environmental score. And what you
Mm-hmm.
see on NVD is just the CVSS base score. And the creators of CVSS, the maintainers, the folks from the SIG, they specifically highlight the fact that you shouldn't use CVSS base as your sole, like for vulnerability prioritization. But as consumer organizations, they see this is the score that they get from NVD, and they don't do this
Right.
additional like enrichment with
Mm-hmm.
the temporal environmental context, and then they use it for prioritization, which it wasn't designed to do. It's a metric for severity of the vulnerability, but it doesn't take into account, again, like, is there an exploit available, what's the likelihood of exploitation,
Mm-hmm.
what's the likelihood of exploitation in the context of my environment, etc. So that's, I think, is a main problem with the way that people currently use CVSS. So I think there's also
Right.
like educational aspects to do there.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So and then you have like additional. I think EPSS is really shows like uh, high potential in terms of
Mm-hmm.
adding an additional signal for prioritization. Like like regarding, if I go back to CVSS, so we said, okay, it's
Mm-hmm.
not really a reflection of risk. It's also like not really scalable, because if you look at NVD, 57% of the vulnerabilities that have CVSS 3 score are vulnerabilities that are high and critical vulnerabilities. So even if you say, like fix or focus only on the highs and the crits, you're still left with too much vulnerabilities, far less that
Yeah.
far more than you can handle. So most
Mm-hmm.
organizations usually are able to address like 10% of their vulnerability backlog. So
Yeah.
and other than that, like a lot of those vulnerabilities that are highs and criticals, they won't ever be exploited. So because less than 5%
Yeah.
of vulnerabilities will actually be exploited, like, and even a fraction of those are exploitable in the context of your environment. So I think this
Mm-hmm.
is where like EPSS comes in, because it allows you to get that visibility into this aspect of exploitability. So EPSS or things like threat intelligent feeds like CISA-KEV and others allows you to take into account that aspect of exploitability, which again is a very really strong signal for prioritization, simply because of the fact that the majority of vulnerabilities are not ever exploited. So
And
that's
that
like.
goes back to what you were saying earlier, right? There is that sheer volume which sometimes gets overwhelming. And as you said, like there are 57,000 critical and high. You cannot fix them. Uh,
Exactly.
and by the time you fix few, there would be few more which are discovered. So it becomes a challenge. So
Yeah.
that brings me to the question. Let's say I'm running a growing startup in either health tech or fintech. What process should I follow?
Okay, so that, again, it's a great question, and I think like the earlier question about like as a startup or a leader just starting up, we should start with
Mm-hmm.
the basics, like we did before. So the basics in the context of vulnerability management, the way I see them, are visibility. So make sure that you know what you have, that you have an SBOM, whether it's, there are enough of open source tools that can provide you with an SBOM, like SIFT, like dependency track, which is an OS project. So
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't necessarily have to be a commercial project. Obviously, commercial projects have their benefits, and I work at one of a commercial project that offers those benefits. But again, it doesn't have to be, straight off the bat something commercial. There are a lot of open source solutions and tools that can get you that visibility. And once you have
Mm-hmm.
that, then start layering that like additional context. So as I mentioned before, there are a lot of different feeds like CISA-KEV or EPSS, which are, they're freely available. You can consume them. You can enrich your vulnerability data. A lot of the commercial tools already, it's what I'm glad to see is it's becoming table stakes. EPSS, CISA-KEV, things like that in the past that weren't there, that we just had CVSS or like proprietary scores from different vendors.
Mm-hmm.
So we're starting to see that becoming table stake, which is great. But you can also consume it by yourself. It's freely available, accessible online, and so layer in that context. So if you have that asset inventory, so layer
Mm-hmm.
that in as well, and map your critical assets, and then you can take all that context, and again, it can be a gradual process. So if you don't
Right.
have
Yeah.
asset inventories, then that's okay. So then just use the CVSS. You can use, for example, the vector, and like focus on vulnerabilities that are exploitable via the network, or network facing assets if you have that. But if not, then use the EPSS and CISA-KEV, and things of that nature. And then you have the SSVC, which is again another great resource, which is the stakeholder specific vulnerability categorization, which is
Mm-hmm.
I would sum it up like simply as basically a decision tree that you
Mm-hmm.
take this information and you have and you form a decision process around it. So it allows you to both communicate internally or externally, like to auditors or whatever. This is how we prioritize vulnerabilities at the moment. So, for example,
Okay.
is the vulnerability like if you have a tool like Resilient that can tell you if something is loaded or accessible, do like reachability analysis, then fine, you can use that. If you don't have that, then you can say, okay, if the vulnerability is likely to be exploited, then it goes here. If not, like
Mm-hmm.
basically PSS or CISA. So you can tailor it based on your the level of context, the amount of information you have, and also based on your capacity. So you can kind of build a tree in a way that the
Mm-hmm.
bottom layer will give you the top 20%, 10%. If you know that you can only handle 10% of vulnerabilities in a given month, then make sure that you
Mm-hmm.
build a decision process that at the like the bottom of the funnel, you have these 10% of vulnerabilities that matter most in terms of the risk reduction. So this
Yeah.
is something
So
that I
I
see.
like how you structured it, right? Like start with the basics, get some of the visibility through SBOMs and all, then start ingesting your like CSACAP data or threat intel or the EPSS integration. And then if you have asset related information, asset information, bring in that. So as the organization scales, like start tackling one of these areas so that you sort of add more context to the dependencies or vulnerabilities, and that helps you with the prioritization.
Yeah, exactly. So start with the visibility aspects, like know what you have, and
Hmm.
then start like layering additional context and so that you can make more informed decisions about the prioritization.
Yeah, yeah, makes a lot of sense. And that's a great way to end the security section as well. Thank you so much, Yotam, for the lovely conversation. Here are a few important points which stood out for me. The first one is context is the key when it comes to vulnerability management. Instead of focusing on vulnerabilities by severity, organizations should evaluate the exploitability and actively exploited vulnerabilities for prioritization. The second one is when looking at vulnerabilities, do not take CVS's base score at face value. Organizations should understand and utilize the other aspects like the temporal and environmental elements and the score as well. The third one is from a supply chain security perspective, start with basics like SBOM so that it helps with visibility, but add additional layers like CISA, CAV, threat intel, EPSS score, asset information, and SSVC for additional context and use that for prioritization. Thank you. We have another section which primarily focuses on rating security practices. So the way it works is I'll share a security practice, and you need to rate them one through five, five being the best. And again, like if you want to add context to why you think it's a one or a five or
Mhm.
any number, that would help. Um, so let me start with the first one. The first one is conduct periodic security audits to identify vulnerabilities, threats, and weaknesses in your systems and applications.
Okay, so I think it's super important, but so I would say even five, but I would alter this the maybe the sentence a bit. I don't think that like I think that the keyword here is pure. I think it's important, but ideally I change the word periodic and into like continuous because I
Ah.
think you'd want to continuously monitor because as we like mentioned earlier on, like in the world that we're living in with CI and CD, things are constantly changing. Things are very dynamic,
Mhm.
so you can have a Docker container with a version that has no vulnerabilities, and the next day you pull in the latest version that has now a new vulnerability or something is discovered. So you have to have this continuous monitoring aspect. So when things change, dependencies change, new high profile vulnerabilities surface, then you are able to know about it. That's one, and
Mm-hmm.
then action um, based on that. Take action based on that.
Okay, makes sense. The second one is provide training and awareness programs to employees so that they can identify and respond to potential security threats.
So I would say I would go with maybe a three. Not
Okay.
because I don't think it's important. I think it's super important, the educational aspect. But I think
Mm-hmm.
again, because of the reality that we live in, things change like constantly and at a very high pace.
Mm-hmm.
And technology is changing so fast so that you will always have like new emerging technologies that require like additional training and awareness. Like for example, let's take again like the LLM landscape. Like if we go back a year, no one knew what prompt injection is, and now everyone's talking about it. So it's hard to keep up with these shifts in like the it's not linear. It's like jumps. So
Mm-hmm.
so I think it's again, and I'm not saying don't educate. It's super important, or the move like to more memory safe languages. Again, it's important, but I think what's more important like are like the principles, to focus on the
Mm-hmm.
principles. Because technology will keep changing.
Makes sense. The last one is develop and regularly test an incident response plan to help quickly detect, respond to, and recover from security incidents.
So that one I would also give a five. I think it's super important. I think it's really and like one of the things that I got to do for a while at PayPal, which was I took a lot from, is doing like security control testing, and I think that is a practice that is often not given enough credit. Not people don't do it enough, and
Mm-hmm.
organization can have like, especially the big ones, as the bigger the organization, the more tooling it has, but you don't
Mm-hmm.
always validate that these tools can do what they say that they're able to do. And I think it's super important, both in terms of, so these kind of things like tabletop exercises and check like validating your incident response um, team, and making sure
Mm-hmm.
that your tools say do what they say they can do, identify gaps, and also how you can better leverage and create synergies with the different data points that you have from these different tools and build processes around that. So I think that is a super important and kind of undervalued even practice.
Yeah, and I think you highlighted tabletop exercises, right? Generally, it's recommended that you do those exercises every few months so that you understand your preparedness, incident response preparedness. So yeah,
Mhm.
you're spot on there. So yeah, thank you so much, Yotam, for joining us and sharing your insights on vulnerability management and supply chain security.
My pleasure. It was a great talk, and again, thanks for having me. Had a great time.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure here as well. And to our viewers, thank you so much for watching. Hope you have learned something new. If you have any questions around security, share those at scale20.com. We'll get those answered by an expert in the security space. See you in our next episode. Thank you.